I never thought my sister would go this far. But then again, I'd never thought she'd commit fraud either, so clearly I didn't know her as well as I believed I did. My name is Kezia, and this is the story of how my sister Lenore's desperate attempt to discredit me ended up destroying her entire life instead. It's a story about family betrayal, about the lengths people will go to when cornered, and about how the truth, no matter how hard someone tries to bury it, always has a way of surfacing. It all started when I discovered something I shouldn't have. I was helping my mother, Vivienne, organize some financial paperwork after she'd undergone major surgery. Mom had asked me to go through her tax returns and insurance documents to get everything in order while she recovered. She'd always been meticulous about her finances, obsessive even, so I wasn't expecting to find anything unusual or alarming. But there it was, buried deep in a manila folder labeled medical expenses, a series of invoices and payment receipts that didn't add up. My mother had been paying a woman named Dr. Sylvia Mentworth over $18,000 for what was labeled as specialized nutrition counseling and wellness optimization services. The invoices spanned 3 years, each one for around $500 per session, with notes about customized dietary interventions and holistic health optimization. The thing was, my mother had never mentioned this woman to me. She'd never talked about seeing a nutritionist or wellness counselor. And more concerning, when I looked more closely at the invoices, they didn't match any legitimate medical practice I could find in our area. The addresses were vague and incomplete. The phone numbers were disconnected when I tried calling them. The business license numbers didn't correspond to any registered medical practitioners in our state. More damning still, when I did a deeper search online, I found that these exact same invoices, with only slightly altered names and dates and client information, had been sent to at least 3 dozen other elderly people in our community. There was a pattern here. A very deliberate, very organized pattern of systematic financial exploitation. My first instinct was to tell my mother immediately and let her handle it. But before I could even process what I was looking at, I found something else that made my blood run cold. A bank transfer authorization form that had my mother's signature on it, approving a wire transfer of $5,000 to a business account called Mentworth Wellness Solutions, LLC. Except the signature didn't look quite right. I'd been looking at my mother's signature for 32 years. I knew how she signed her name. I knew the particular flourish she added to the M in Mentworth. I knew the exact angle and pressure she applied to her pen. And this signature was close but not quite accurate. It had the right general shape, but the proportions were slightly off. The letters were a bit too uniform, the hand too steady. It looked like someone had practiced copying her signature, had gotten very close, but hadn't quite achieved perfect replication. That's when I realized what I was looking at. Someone had been systematically defrauding my mother. Someone had been accessing her accounts, forging her signature on official documents, and stealing money through an elaborate scheme involving fake medical services that didn't exist. And I had a terrible, sinking suspicion about who that someone might be. Lenore had always been the one with financial struggles. She'd gone through 3 marriages, each one leaving her more desperate and more bitter than the last. She'd borrowed money from family members repeatedly, always with promises to pay it back, never following through. She declared bankruptcy twice, once at age 35 and again at 42. And most recently, she'd been living in a studio apartment in a less than desirable part of town, working an administrative job that paid barely enough to cover her rent and utilities, let alone her other expenses. More importantly, and this was the crucial detail, Lenore had power of attorney over my mother's finances. Mom had given it to her 5 years ago when Lenore had offered to help manage her investments and pay her bills while she traveled. I'd thought it was a generous gesture at the time, though I'd suggested that perhaps both of us should have power of attorney so we could check on each other's decisions. But Mom had declined, saying she trusted Lenore completely and didn't want to hurt her feelings by implying she needed to be monitored. I printed out all the suspicious documents and made multiple copies. I organized them chronologically, highlighting the questionable signatures and the inconsistencies in the invoices. Then I sat down with my mother in her living room, carefully spreading the documents across the coffee table, and walked her through what I'd discovered. Her face went pale as she examined each piece of evidence. Her hands trembled as she looked at the forged signatures. Her voice became small and distant as she realized the scope of what had been happening. "That's impossible," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't believe her own words. "Lenore would never, she couldn't possibly." "Mom, I know this is incredibly difficult to hear," I said gently, "but look at these invoices. Look at these signatures. Look at the patterns. Someone has been stealing from you for 3 years, and based on the power of attorney you gave Lenore, based on the fact that only she has access to these accounts, the only person who could have done this is her." My mother's hands shook as she examined each document more carefully. She pulled out her checkbook and compared the signatures on her own checks to the ones on the authorization forms. She picked up her phone and tried calling the numbers on the invoices, only to get disconnected number recordings. She sat in silence for a long time, processing the betrayal, the violation of trust, the devastating reality that her own daughter had stolen from her. "We need to talk to her," my mother finally said, her voice hollow. "There must be an explanation. There must be something we're missing." There wasn't. When we confronted Lenore at her apartment the next evening, she initially denied everything with the kind of defensive anger that only comes when someone is caught in an obvious lie. But when I showed her the evidence, when I pulled out the forged signatures and compared them to her own writing, when I presented the fake invoices and the suspicious bank transfers and the overwhelming documentation of fraud, she broke down completely. "I needed the money," she sobbed, her entire body shaking with the kind of desperation that comes from someone who knows they're completely caught. "My rent was going up. My car needed repairs. I was drowning, Kezia. I was absolutely drowning. I thought I'd just borrow a little bit just until I could get on my feet and stabilize my situation. I was going to pay it back. I swear to God I was going to pay it back." "Lenore, you stole over $18,000 from Mom," I said, my voice cold and steady despite the anger churning inside me. "You forged her signature on official documents. You created fake medical services. You set up fraudulent business accounts. This isn't borrowing. This is fraud. This is a serious federal crime." "Please don't tell anyone," Lenore begged, falling to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Please, I'll pay it back, every penny. I'll set up a payment plan. I'll work extra hours. I'll do whatever it takes. Just please don't press charges. Don't go to the police." My mother was devastated in a way I'd never seen before. She'd loved Lenore deeply, had always been her strongest supporter and defender. She'd made excuses for her failures, her poor choices, her repeated financial disasters. The betrayal cut through her like a knife, severing something fundamental in their relationship. "We need to go to the police," I said firmly. "We need to file a report and let them investigate." "No," my mother said, her voice distant and hollow. I can't do that. She's my daughter. She's my child. I can't be the one to put her in prison." "Mom, she stole from you. She forged your signature. She violated your trust in the most fundamental way possible. This is a serious crime, and if we don't report it, she'll never face any consequences. She'll probably do it again." "I know," Mom said quietly, sinking into a chair. "But I'm not going to press charges. I just want the money back. I want her to get help for whatever is wrong with her, but I'm not going to be responsible for putting my daughter in prison." I understood my mother's hesitation, though I disagreed with it deeply. Family loyalty is a powerful thing, and the thought of being responsible for sending your own child to prison is a burden most parents can't bear. But I also knew what this meant. Lenore wasn't going to face any legal consequences for her actions, which meant she'd never learn that her behavior had serious repercussions, which meant she'd probably do it again. "Fine," I said reluctantly. "But she needs to know that this ends now. No more access to your accounts, no more power of attorney, and she needs to repay every cent she stole, every single dollar." My mother nodded wearily. "I'll talk to her." But that's where things took a dramatic turn that I didn't anticipate, a turn that would ultimately prove far more consequential than the original fraud. Lenore, desperate and cornered and facing the very real possibility of losing her family completely, decided that the best defense was a strong offense. If she couldn't deny the fraud, If she couldn't minimize it or rationalize it, then she'd attack the credibility of the person exposing it. She'd make me look like the liar. She'd make me look like the criminal. She'd flip the entire narrative on its head. 2 weeks after the confrontation at her apartment, I received a phone call from a private investigator named Marcus Holloway. His tone was professional, but carried an undertone of threat, the kind of voice someone uses when they're implying that you have something to hide. "Ms. Kezia, I've been hired to conduct a comprehensive investigation into certain financial discrepancies in your mother's accounts," he said, speaking with the careful precision of someone reading from a script. "I'd like to arrange a time to speak with you about your involvement in these matters." My stomach dropped like a stone. "Who hired you?" "I'm not at liberty to disclose the identity of my client, but I assure you this is a completely legitimate investigation into potential fraud. If you have nothing to hide, I'm sure you'll be happy to cooperate with my inquiry." I hung up without agreeing to anything and immediately called my best friend, Natalia. She was a paralegal who worked for a major law firm, and she was one of the sharpest people I knew. "This is a smear campaign," Natalia said without hesitation, her voice tight with anger. "Your sister is trying to turn this entire situation around on you. She's going to claim that you're the one who committed the fraud and that you're trying to frame her to cover up your own crimes." "But that's insane. I have all the evidence. The forged signatures, the fake invoices, everything. It all points directly to her." "Doesn't matter," Natalia said grimly. "She's betting that if she can create enough doubt, if she can make it look like you're the guilty party, she can undermine your credibility and make the whole situation go away. It's a classic deflection tactic used by people who are caught in crimes. Throw enough chaos at the accusation, create enough confusion, and hope that the mud sticks. It's despicable, but it's effective sometimes." Over the next month, the private investigator contacted me repeatedly. He called my cell phone at odd hours. He showed up at my workplace, asking my colleagues questions about my financial situation and my relationship with my mother. He wanted access to my bank statements. He wanted to see my computer and my email accounts. He wanted to interview my friends and colleagues. He was building a case, clearly, but a case against whom? I refused to cooperate with most of his requests. I gave him a basic written statement about discovering the fraud, and nothing more. I hired my own attorney, a sharp and experienced woman named Delilah Sinclair who specialized in fraud cases and had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in court. "Don't say anything else to this investigator," Delilah advised during our first meeting. "Don't answer any more of his calls. Don't meet with him in person. Let me handle all communication and document everything. Every call, every contact, every attempt he makes to intimidate or pressure you. We're going to need that documentation." What Lenore didn't realize, what she couldn't have predicted, was that a private investigator conducting an investigation like this leaves a detailed trail of evidence. And trails can be followed by people who know how to track them. Delilah hired her own investigator, a woman named Cassandra who was even more thorough and meticulous than the one Lenore had hired. Cassandra began digging into Marcus Holloway's background, his previous cases, his methods, his clients, and his ethical violations. What she found was absolutely damning. Marcus Holloway had a long history of working on behalf of people engaged in criminal activity. He'd been hired multiple times by defendants in fraud cases to investigate accusers and attempt to discredit them. He'd been sued twice for intimidation and harassment. He'd been investigated by the state licensing board on 3 separate occasions for ethical violations. He'd never been convicted of anything serious, but his methods were aggressive, often crossed ethical and legal lines, and showed a pattern of prioritizing his clients' interests over the law. More importantly, Cassandra discovered that Holloway had been conducting his investigation in ways that violated multiple state and federal privacy laws. He'd attempted to access my bank records without proper authorization or legal warrant. He'd tried to bribe a clerk at my workplace to give him access to my personnel file and employment history. He'd hired someone to follow me around the city, documenting my movements and photographing me without my consent or knowledge. He'd even attempted to access my medical records by impersonating a law enforcement officer. When Delilah presented this extensive evidence to me, I was shocked and horrified. He's breaking the law, multiple federal laws. He's committing crimes. Yes, Delilah confirmed calmly. And more importantly, we have documentation of all of it. This investigator was hired to intimidate and harass you, and in doing so, he's created a clear and comprehensive record of his illegal conduct that will be very difficult for him to explain away. But the best part, the part that would ultimately destroy Lenore's entire scheme and have consequences far beyond what anyone anticipated, was what Cassandra discovered when she dug into Holloway's communications with whoever had hired him. Through a combination of legal discovery and some methods I didn't entirely understand, Cassandra gained access to Holloway's email database, which had been improperly secured. There were emails there, thousands of them, in communications between Holloway and his client, discussing strategy, discussing how to make me look guilty of fraud, discussing how to undermine my credibility and shift suspicion onto me, discussing how to make it appear that I had created the fake invoices and had been the one accessing my mother's accounts. And in one particularly damaging email chain, there were specific references to the Mentworth fraud scheme and detailed discussion of how to make it look like I had masterminded the entire operation while Lenore was an innocent bystander. The strategy was laid out explicitly. Create a counter-narrative, make the accuser look guilty, confuse the victim, and hope that my mother would ultimately believe her other daughter over the evidence. The emails didn't explicitly name Lenore as the client, but the context made it absolutely clear. Holloway was being paid by my sister to build a false criminal case against me to cover up her own crimes. "This is it," Delilah said, her eyes bright with the certainty of a lawyer who knows she has a winning case. "This is exactly what we need. This is the evidence that proves everything." She immediately filed a report with the police department and provided them with copies of all the evidence. She presented them with documentation of the fraud against my mother, the forged signatures, the fake invoices, and the fake medical practice. She presented them with comprehensive evidence of the intimidation campaign against me. She presented them with the emails proving that someone, clearly Lenore, had hired an investigator to conduct illegal surveillance and harassment against me. The police investigated thoroughly. They interviewed my mother, who finally broke down completely and told them the entire truth about the fraud Lenore had committed. They interviewed Lenore, who initially denied everything with righteous indignation, but eventually admitted to the financial crimes when confronted with the overwhelming evidence. But here's where things got really interesting and took a turn that nobody could have predicted. When the police subpoenaed Holloway's complete records as part of their investigation, they discovered that he'd been conducting similar campaigns for multiple people. He'd been hired to investigate and discredit accusers in at least 7 other fraud cases. Some of those cases involved elderly people, just like my mother. Some involved employees accusing employers of wage theft and labor violations. Some involved consumers reporting fraudulent businesses and Ponzi schemes. The patterns were clear and undeniable. Holloway had developed a business model around intimidating and discrediting fraud victims and whistleblowers on behalf of criminals who could afford to pay his substantial fees. The police referred the matter to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI got involved. What had started as a relatively straightforward case of elder fraud, committed by my sister, had evolved into a much larger investigation into a coordinated scheme involving multiple criminals and a professional investigator who was actively intimidating and discrediting fraud victims and whistleblowers. Holloway was arrested at his office. He was charged with harassment, stalking, violations of federal privacy laws, fraud, and conspiracy. He faced years in prison. And Lenore, she was arrested and charged with elder fraud, identity theft, forgery, and conspiracy to commit witness intimidation. The conspiracy charge was the key piece. By hiring an investigator to conduct an illegal campaign against me, she had crossed from simple theft into something far more serious under federal law. The prosecutors offered her a deal. If she testified against Holloway and provided detailed information about how she'd hired him, what she'd asked him to do, and the communications they'd had, they'd recommend a significantly reduced sentence. Lenore, facing the reality of decades in federal prison, took the deal. She pleaded guilty to all charges. She was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. The irony was so perfect it almost hurt to contemplate. In trying to prove that I was lying, in hearing an investigator to build a false criminal case against me, Lenore had created such a massive and detailed paper trail of evidence that she'd proven not only her original fraud, but also her attempt to intimidate a witness and obstruct justice. She'd actually made her own situation exponentially worse. The media picked up the story with voracious interest. It was exactly the kind of tale that makes for compelling headlines. Sister commits elder fraud, then tries to discredit accuser by hiring private investigator to conduct illegal surveillance. Entire scheme backfires spectacularly. News outlets ran extensive stories about the investigation into Holloway and his illegal practices. Several of his other clients ended up being investigated as a direct result of the FBI's investigation. 3 of them faced their own criminal charges. My workplace was incredibly supportive throughout the entire ordeal. My supervisor assured me that my job was secure, that the company stood behind me. My colleagues rallied around me with genuine concern and kindness. My friends were steadfast and loyal, and my reputation, which Lenore had tried so desperately to destroy, was actually enhanced by the revelation of her scheme and my refusal to be intimidated. I became someone people admired for standing up for my mother, for not backing down under pressure, for refusing to be intimidated by false accusations and illegal surveillance. Natalia threw a celebration dinner at her apartment with close friends. "You did it," she said, raising a glass of champagne. "You did the absolutely right thing, and justice actually prevailed. Do you know how rare that is? Do you understand how unusual it is for the truth to actually triumph in these kinds of situations?" "I wish it hadn't come to this," I said quietly, looking at the faces of my friends around the table. "I wish Lenore had just admitted to what she did, paid back the money, and gotten help for whatever financial desperation or psychological issues drove her to commit fraud. Instead, she's going to spend 4 years in federal prison. My mother has lost a daughter. I've lost a sister. Our family is fractured in ways that might never heal." "She made those choices," Natalia reminded me gently, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "You didn't force her to commit fraud. You didn't force her to hire a private investigator. You didn't force her to conduct an illegal intimidation campaign. She did all of that. All you did was tell the truth and refuse to be intimidated. That took courage, and you should be proud of yourself." Over the following months, as Lenore's sentencing date approached and the appeals process began, I received letters from her. They were apologetic, remorseful, asking for my forgiveness for what she'd done. In one particularly painful letter, she wrote, "Kezia, I've had a lot of time to think about what I've done, about how I stole from Mom, about how I then tried to destroy you to cover it up. I was so desperate, so afraid of facing the consequences of my actions, that I convinced myself that if I could just make you look guilty, if I could just prove that you were lying, everything would somehow be okay. I thought if I could prove you were the criminal, I could prove I was innocent. I was so wrong. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I did to Mom. I'm sorry for what I did to you. I hope someday you can forgive me, though I know I don't deserve it." I didn't respond to the letters. I couldn't. The hurt was too fresh, the betrayal too deep, the violation of trust too complete. My sister had tried to destroy me to save herself. She'd tried to criminally frame me for her own crimes. That was something I needed time to process, maybe years of time, maybe a lifetime. My mother struggled with her own complicated feelings about everything that had happened. She visited Lenore in prison once, but it was so emotionally difficult that she couldn't bring herself to go again. The visit left her devastated and crying for days afterward. She did, however, send money for Lenore's commissary account, still unable to completely sever ties with her daughter despite everything that had happened. Love doesn't just disappear when someone betrays you, even profoundly. As for me, I'd learned something profound that I never forgot. People will surprise you, sometimes with extraordinary kindness and loyalty, but sometimes with the absolute depths of their desperation and selfishness. The challenge is to keep your heart open to the first kind of surprise while protecting yourself from the second. I kept the folder with all the original documents. The forged signatures, the fake invoices, the suspicious bank transfers, the emails from the private investigator that proved the intimidation campaign. I kept every piece of evidence that showed how Lenore's attempt to discredit me had instead exposed her own fraud so completely that it had led to federal charges and a 7-year prison sentence for an investigator who'd been conducting illegal surveillance against dozens of people. Sometimes I'd take that folder out and look through it, not out of bitterness, but out of a kind of amazed recognition of how the universe has a way of balancing itself out. Lenore had tried to make me look guilty of her own crimes. In doing so, she'd created such a clear and undeniable trail of evidence that she'd ended up destroying not just herself, but also an entire scheme that had been harming dozens of other people. The truth, it turned out, had been the most powerful weapon all along. And sometimes the biggest revenge isn't something you plan or execute consciously. Sometimes it's simply the natural consequence of someone else's poor choices, the inevitable result of trying to hide one crime by committing more crimes, the perfect cosmic justice that comes when a lie is told in desperate pursuit of concealing the truth. That's what happened to my sister Lenore, and that's the story of how her attempt to prove I was lying accidentally exposed her own fraud instead.